More than 100 college and university leaders have issued a joint letter condemning the Trump administration's efforts to dictate policies at their private institutions. The letter reads in part, "We speak with one voice against the unprecedented government overreach and political interference now endangering American higher education." Among the people who have signed on is the president of Harvard. The nation's oldest university is at the center of an escalating fight with the White House. And in the latest twist, Harvard is now filing a lawsuit over the freeze of federal funds, which came after the Ivy League school refused to submit to a slew of demands by the Trump administration. Among those demands, that Harvard give the administration access to all university reports on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias on campus generated since October 2023. Also, that the school eliminate DEI programs, make hiring changes, and reform its admissions process. Here's the education secretary in response to Harvard's new lawsuit.
It was a letter that was intended to have both parties sit down again and continue their negotiations. That's what I sincerely hope will happen. But Harvard has now filed a lawsuit. The government will counter. I think we're on very solid grounds that the negotiations that we are having with Harvard and the reason that these funds have been frozen is because of a civil rights issue and not a freedom of speech issue.
And joining us now is Ryan Enos. He is a professor at Harvard and a member of Harvard's chapter of the American Association of University Professors, which is separately suing the Trump administration. Thank you, Professor, for being with us. You hear Secretary McMahon there trying to say it is Harvard that is escalating this with a lawsuit, that this letter was just part of a negotiation, the letter of demands, to be clear. What's your reaction to that?
I think it's an absolutely ridiculous thing to say, and I'm sure that most other people see that as well. Harvard is not escalating anything by simply defending its constitutional rights. That's like would be saying if the government comes in and shuts down a newspaper for saying things they don't like, or tries to shut down a law firm, which incidentally is what the Trump administration has been trying to do, that when that newspaper or that law firm or that university pushes back and says we have a constitutional right to speech, that is an escalation. That's completely against American traditions and American values. When the government attacks people, if they fight back, that is not an escalation of something. It's simply defending your own rights.
She's saying this is a civil rights issue over how Jewish students have been treated. It's not a free speech issue. What's your response to that claim?
You know, similarly, the administration, the Trump administration, is making claims about things that in many ways violate common sense. It's a pretext in order to attack what they consider to be their political enemies. Donald Trump does not care about anti-Semitism, and I don't think any reasonable person would believe he does. He has people in his inner circle that give Nazi salutes. He's dined with white supremacists. And they have said over and over again that there's an issue of anti-Semitism, acute anti-Semitism on Harvard's campus in a way that demands some kind of civil rights intervention. But the acute anti-Semitism does not exist on Harvard's campus. To the extent that there might be anti-Semitism, just like any other bigotry that might exist at Harvard, like it would exist anywhere, that's something that Harvard could take steps to redress, but is not something that requires the cancellation of things like cancer funding for cancer research or research on Alzheimer's disease or all the other things that Donald Trump has tried to attack for political purposes.
Lou Gehrig's disease, the list goes on, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of those cuts mean in a moment. I do want to ask you, though, and let's put aside that this is a president who is historically selective about which anti-Semitism he condemns, because obviously that doesn't mean universities should be. But the Anti-Defamation League, which I note has expressed concern about potential overreach by the administration, says anti-Semitic incidents hit a record high last year in their annual audit that's out today, and that it was fueled in part by campus protests. They have Massachusetts as number 4 nationally for anti-Semitic incidents. They have Boston and Cambridge as the hot spots in Massachusetts. And I know that you told my colleague Jessica Dean this weekend that Harvard has done enough to protect Jewish students on campus. Obviously, you're open to them doing more, but I wonder what you think they should be doing if this deserves further action.
So I believe that any type of bigotry deserves action. And I want to make that crystal clear. But I would challenge the Anti-Defamation League or anybody else to make very clear as well that they can separate constitutional rights, especially ones that come to protesting government action, like students protesting the United States support for Israel and its war on Gaza, from anti-Semitism. And if we start conflating those two things, then we are in very dangerous ground, because people in the United States have an absolute right to protest government action, and that does not make something anti-Semitic. And if you look at what the Anti-Defamation League has claimed, most of those incidents that they claim are incidences of people protesting a war. And that is clearly not anti-Semitism. And in fact, it's something that we should welcome in this country, because we believe in dissent on college campuses or anywhere else.
Yeah, I do want to note, I think they tried to be very careful about not conflating those. But I want to ask you a little bit more about this fight, because in the case of Harvard, you have, as you mentioned, all of this research money. So much of it, I think more than 10% of Harvard's research money, a lot of it has to do with diseases, looking for things to save lives.
President Trump and his MAGA acolytes are escalating their attacks on American universities, and they are trying to make an example out of Harvard. Today, Department of Homeland Security demanded that the university's records of foreign students, and they demanded to see them, and then they threatened to revoke Harvard's ability to host those very students. The House Oversight Committee launched an investigation into the university, and in a very disturbing example of the executive branch influence over taxation, the Internal Revenue Service is making plans to rescind Harvard's tax-exempt status on orders from the president himself, as stop work orders are now rolling in for Harvard's researchers after a $2.2 billion pause in federal funds. And this is all because the university refused demands to make sweeping changes to its policies, which included requirements to audit the viewpoints of the student body, faculty, and staff. This is just the tip of the spear, folks. Semaphore was first to report the next phase of the administration's pressure campaign on universities, which will include putting their endowments under a microscope. Back with me is Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. Janae, first of all, kudos to Harvard for standing up, because so many large organizations, schools, and law firms have bent the knee and acquiesced in this moment. I want to play for you what Caroline Levitt had to say about this very issue on Harvard from the White House press briefing.
All the president is asking, don't break federal law, and then you can have your federal funding. I think the president is also begging a good question. More than $2 billion out the door to Harvard when they have a more than $50 billion endowment. Why are the American taxpayers subsidizing a university that has billions of dollars in the bank already? And we certainly should not be funding a place where such grave anti-Semitism exists.
Janae, my read from it is what the president is doing and the White House is attempting to do is illegal. Is this all not illegal?
It's absolutely illegal. And I want to be really, really clear. To shroud this as some sort of protection against anti-Semitism is actually offensive. The Legal Defense Fund stands firmly against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against violence for any students and intimidation. That's very clear. That's not what this is about. And many Jewish groups have made it very clear that they do not want their names used as an excuse to break the law, as we see here. This is one of our nation's most revered educational institutions as part of the American university system, which is, revered around the world. And what this administration is attempting to do is to break one of the biggest universities, one of the most renowned, in order to make every other university and institution heel to this administration. And the ultimate goal is to make it so that there cannot be a diversity of viewpoints, there won't be a diversity of students, there won't be unfettered freedom of speech and expression on university campuses, because he doesn't like some of the ideas that are being taught in universities across the country. Because he doesn't like it doesn't mean that it is unlawful and that he can weaponize the government's power to try to harm universities that he doesn't get along with or that he doesn't like. And so I'm very, very proud of Harvard for standing up against these attempts to abuse authority even further. And they are not alone. Stanford and Yale and other universities have stood with Harvard. And it's what we're also seeing in the legal profession. This is just the same playbook that he tried with certain law firms who did capitulate, and then others who are backing up and saying, we are not going to be bullied by this administration. That's why the Legal Defense Fund was so proud to file an amicus brief in support of the law firms that are standing up and standing back, because we suffered similar consequences when we were fighting for civil rights in the 60s, when we were trying to end legal apartheid in this country. The reason that we can sit here today in an integrated society is because we stood up to the offensive tactics from states and governments that tried to make us back down. And so we're urging every institution in this country not to back down to this administration, because we know what we're doing is right. We know what universities are doing is right. And we know that to back up a bully, you've got to look them dead in the eye and say, I'm not turning back.
Honestly, if you give a bully your lunch money on Monday, they're coming back Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and the next Monday again to get it.
Educational levels across the spectrum, up and down, from like, elementary school to the biggest, most prestigious universities in the country, Trump is getting, heckled. I was going to say heckled and jeckled, but he's getting heckled and booed by students and teachers and administrators because his approach, at the very least, is causing pain, if not is endangering the very process of education. We've seen it. It started earlier in his term when he said, I'm going to dismantle the Department of Education. And the assumption from a lot of people was like, this is going to make the Republicans really happy. But when you actually spoke to teachers and students and parents and administrators, even in very Republican parts of the country, if those were not rich Republican areas, we're not talking about country club Republicans. We're talking about, the stereotypical MAGA hat wearers. They were like, well, no, this is actually bad for us, Mr. Trump, because the Federal Department of Education is what helps equalize payments a little bit. It's not perfect and more needs to be done, but our school would suffer way more than a rich person's school in liberal New York. Because we need that federal support and guidance and money and all of that. You're seeing it at the biggest universities, where Trump not only is cutting funding, again, in a totally politically motivated manner, which will affect very important research that's going to have immediate impacts. In 50 years from now, people will be like, why is America not scientifically as dynamic? You could point 50 years from now to this moment if things don't change. But also, the university's ability to operate as free institutions, right? Donald Trump is a fascistic threat, and whether it's students, professors, or administrators, teachers, parents, everyone is quickly realizing that Donald Trump is the most anti-education and anti-intellectual freedom president in the history of the country.